Hugh Richardson, how are you,
Good
man?
morning. Good morning. How
Good
you doing?
morning
You
to
okay?
you. I'm all good. I'm all good here. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate having you on.
My pleasure, man.
Um,
My pleasure.
yeah,
It's sort of nice to spend even more time together, which
indeed. Yeah.
we
For
will talk
those,
about.
yeah, for those who don't know, we are on a gig together at the moment. I should be so lucky. The tour, and yeah, it's a great show.
Yeah,
If you're around the UK, come and watch it and hear us play.
yeah.
And
But we're
yeah,
also sort of veterans of many more shows, like several bat shows, several
yeah.
God knows how
Just
many
a,
of.
just a few shows.
Yeah.
We actually were talking about it the other day that we think we probably played more than 1,000 shows together in the
I
past
know.
years.
Oh, God, it's scary, isn't it? I.
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, between like Bat, where I was obviously dapping for our common friend Elliot Henshaw, who was also on the podcast in our first
I
episode.
saw. I
Um,
saw. It's really
yeah,
good.
yeah. He's a great guy, and then weddings, gigs, other stuff. Like we've been playing together for so long. I
Mm.
guess the cool thing would be maybe let's start from there. Like,
Yeah, sure.
what do you think? It's a great thing to make bass and drums play well together.
Oh, good question.
Not saying that we do play well
Yeah.
together, but
Not to, I'm trying to think of a phrase, but it's probably too early in the morning for that. Uh, I think I think there definitely has to be the kind of common willingness to listen just beyond oneself, because like by the nature of the two instruments, you are, the sum of the parts. You are a section, not just the one thing. And it's weird. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. I think Steve Gadd, I remember once talked about how he defined sort of grooves in rhythm sections, which it's kind of shaped the way that I view a lot of it. As he would define it as like an agreement between the people of sorts. Like obviously in a metaphorical sense, but I think that has to be the first thing. I've kind of noticed that really whenever I think about drummers that I've played with a lot, in one way or another, that's always happened. Sometimes people will just sort of sit there and listen and sort of follow, or know when to lead, or whenever not. Other times, like I remember Elliot has done this a couple of times. He's fantastic at it. We've done a few gigs together where we obviously did a lot of bat gigs together, but we did some Leia Salonga stuff. We did our last tour. We've got the next one coming up, and we've done some other gigs together as well, with like where it's been more of like a rhythm section and an orchestra type of thing. And he would just sort of come over and say, "Oh, just so you know, I'm kind of interpreting conducting signals like this, not like that," or just so you know, I'll sort of feel something this way, not that way. But he's always got that awareness of trying to listen to drums within the totality of a piece of music, not just thinking about just what drums do, if that makes sense.
it's not saying this is here. It's like where do we want it to be, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And like I think it's so easy for to be honest, musicians that play anything to think their focus should only be just on their instrument and nothing else. And it sort of drives me mad a little bit. You kind of see this line of thinking sometimes on gigs where people will say, well, as long as I play exactly what's on the chart, that's fine, or as long as I'm exactly with the click, that's fine. You think,
Yeah.
no, it can still sound terrible, and it can still be like a really ignorant way of playing. But yeah, so I think there's that. I mean, it's I was trying to chat to someone about this the other day. Like I think, yeah, as well as the kind of willingness to listen, I think what really helps rhythm section players is like not to make this kind of too like lofty and out there, but the way that people kind of construct their mental focus to play a piece of music, I think is really what defines the good and great players. I always like to say that it's a bit like if you think about the type of focus you have when you're driving a car, let's say, If you think about it, you're focused on yourself and everybody else and what you're doing and what everyone else is doing all at the same time. It's and you have to be to kind of make the road safe for everybody. Whereas if you were to do the reverse, which I think is what a lot of people play, where they say a lot of people do when they play. Sorry. Which is, that if they say, oh, well, as long as I do the bass stuff, fine, everybody else can worry about that. If you were saying, okay, well, I want to turn right, as long as I indicate, I don't have to look if anyone's there, the hell with it, I'll just,
Yeah.
you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's not the perfect analogy, but I think playing in a rhythm section, playing in a good band, orchestra, whatever, for me is somewhat similar.
That's a great way to look at it. I guess if I think about obviously when if someone is starting out in the professional settings, for example, they have a lot of practice experience at school, with other musicians and stuff, but they're thinking, okay, Hugh, I hear what you're saying, I understand it logically, but practically, what can I do, to improve this and make the best I can of the gigs that I'm about to do? Like, basically, how do I gain experience without experience?
Oh God, that's an impossible question.
Or optimize the experience that I get.
Yeah, optimize I think is a better word. I mean, to be honest, I remember being exactly like that when I was younger, and you kind of think, okay, well, I can play well now, so that's kind of all there is to it. And I think in the process, you sort of disregard the real value of experience, and it's one of those times I think where like the English have this saying of like, you don't know what you don't know, and I think it's exactly that, because if you think about it, so many of the things that have enabled, well, like guys like us, certainly the generations above us, so people like Elliot and so on, to walk into a gig and be able to sort of settle themselves so quickly is the experience that they have. So I think what I would say to like a lot of the younger people is that, as tempting as it is to try and think, how can I get experience without experience, you are actually really selling yourself short in a way. It would be somewhat like saying, how can I prepare myself for a marathon run in a day? Yes,
I can't.
You can't. And if you try, unless you're in like ridiculous shape anyway, you're gonna suffer a lot. So yeah, I think that's the thing, is that you want to make sure as much as you can that the environment that you learn and you practice in actually resembles the one you want to operate in as much as possible. And music schools do a decent-ish job of that, I think, because they have ensembles and they put on performances and everything, and that's great. I think the trouble is that well, certainly in my experience, like what they didn't do a fantastic job of is teaching us that, beyond a certain point, it's probably not that helpful to actually just sit on your own and practice. You've got to try and work on things in context. So actually sort of learn to, I don't know, perfect a technique on a gig, or learn to, if you're trying to work on, I don't know, whatever it is, fills, chops, solos, whatever, you've got to sort of realise that actually the gig is kind of your practice. But you've also got to tread the line of not being disrespectful to the gig, if that makes sense. So, it's a lot harder. It takes a lot longer time. So that's quite rambling. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's great. Yeah. I guess to dive more into it, obviously, you have a lot of experience teaching both at university level and private students and stuff. I know that you've been, I know you very well, so I know a lot of the stuff that you do. And I know that you're really well focused on how to improve your learning, how to practice, how to turn pro, like, teaching the kids the right things. I guess, how would you explain this process? The process of how to optimize your practice, how to, practice at the gig, but in the right way. Like maybe let's dive more into this side of
Yeah, for sure,
teaching
for
and your
sure.
philosophy.
Oh, so yeah, so I'm a very big, um, yeah. I mean, I believe very firmly that you have to kind of treat your experiences as almost as a form of knowledge, in a sense. I think when it comes to learning, it's obviously not to say that you have to completely disregard all the logical stuff that you can do, or perhaps the more set in stone stuff that you can do, like having a practice routine and so on. But for me, I think what's really helped, and actually weirdly getting into West End shows and tours and that sort of thing has been a big part of this. Is that if let's say if I remember originally starting to think about this through the lens of how do you be consistent across a lot of shows, and originally I would turn up and if I played one show really well, I think, oh, I was really consistent for that show, but I would only think about it on a show to show basis. And then eventually, like the thought comes in is like, oh, I wonder how many good shows I've had across the last 30 days. And I actually used to have
One.
this. Yeah, yeah, well, this is I used to track it on my phone. I'd have this thing where I just used the Notes app. You just put I'd put like a rating of like out of 10 maybe, and I'd be like, okay, well, it's got to be 7 or above out of 10 to be good. And then you look back and you're like, oh, I've had like 5 out of the last 30. Why? I thought it'd be more than that. And then you start thinking about, okay, well, sort of in terms of experiences, what was actually happening on those days? Like, what were the things that were actually helping you do the job better? So it was a slow process of trying to become aware of like what was happening to me, but also just trying to read books or like listen to podcasts with good musicians and so on. And it's really weird, some of the things that would come out of the woodwork and sort of be the ideas that shaped how you approached trying to be consistent. But the more and more I started to move that number up from like 5 good shows to 7 to 15 to whatever, the more and more I realized that actually it was things of the nature of like how I was focusing on the job more so than like what notes I was playing, or whether my posture was 100% correct or something like that. It's obviously not to say that stuff isn't important, but yeah, it was more just trying to take stock of like I guess just the experience you were having and sort of what helped kind of put you in that headspace, if that makes sense.
Have you found any specific things that help you and
Yes.
you think might help other people?
Yes, so there's a really weird. This will be a bit controversial. I know a lot of people don't like this, but I listened to over lockdown. I listened to a really great podcast called Plus One with Eric Krasno,
Okay.
which everybody should go out and look at. So he's got some like massive big hitters on there, and he just talks to them about playing for an hour or two. Like Questlove has been on there, Derek Trucks has been on there, Christian McBride's been on there.
Wow.
But he had, it's insane. I think he stopped it because it was like a lockdown thing. But it's almost like that's almost like a degree in itself. And he did an episode with Charlie Hunter, and Charlie Hunter was talking about this one recording session that he did where he turned up. He's the last person to get there, I think. Everybody gets themselves set up, and just by chance when he gets there, the studio have run out of headphones.
Oh.
So he was like, oh, okay, well, don't worry about it. I'll just sit and play, and like I'll get through it just from knowing what playing sounds like. So he goes into this recording session. He can't hear himself, but he goes to listen back in the control room, and he's like, yeah, I sound really good. And his reasoning for it was that the only thing he had to go off was what other people were doing. He couldn't really sit there and be obsessed with like, is my tone exactly right, or am I I don't know, placing this exactly where I should, because he couldn't hear himself. He just had to focus on what everybody else was doing. And like that's been a big thing. It's like certainly coming out of lockdown, we went into the first BAT tour, I think the UK tour. And I remember across the course of that, I felt like myself come down in my mix more and more and more and more and more and more and more. And yeah, like that was a huge one. And you know, well, fingers crossed they sounded better. Right? It's not recording, it's not for me to say. Yeah, so something like that's a big one. I think trying to focus on maybe like the non-note aspects of music are a big one. You know, so like time and feel is a big one, but even just things like if you're so I think about this quite a lot with the show that me and Alessandro do at the moment. There's 2 ballads in the first half, where all I'm thinking about is like not really notes as such. I pretty much all the time just play whatever's on the page, but I'm just trying to match the kind of intensity of like particularly the singer or the people that are in at the start of the tune with me. And even then,
although you do think about the famous scale that we talk about.
Yeah. If it gets to the point where, you know, the scale is like my celebration of like, yeah, this is going on. But like even little things like that, I find, at least in my ears anyway, it feels like I'm, you know, blending with other people better, like holding everything together a lot better if you're just matched on even the intensity that you play notes with. And I know the sort of margins are fine, and it might seem like a small thing. You know, ironically, I probably would have said it was a small thing if I was listening to this when I was like 21 or something. But I think those are just the fine margins that matter as you get older and as you want to get better. You've got to really...
Going back to what you said before, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Like, you've really got to learn to think beyond just playing notes. But also, like, you got to learn to think about not trying to make every single performance exactly the same. Because even with, I mean, even with some shows that, you know, are very heavily orchestrated or very track heavy or clicked and everything, there are still rooms for those little like micro differences and micro nuances. And that's really what, you know, makes each performance unique, I think.
I think that's also the beauty of live music, you know, because it's the same, but it's not at the same time, you know. It's those things that you cannot get from a computer, you know, like the feel, the you know, how you feel on that day, like changes slightly how you play music, and I think the audience feels it when they come to a gig, and it's great, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean,
yeah, that's amazing.
There's a really good thing I got from, there's a book a jazz critic called Ted Goyer wrote called How to Listen to Jazz, and I remember reading it back, and he had this one section on, you know, trying to define exactly what swing is, and for him he was saying it was one of the criteria is about the interaction that the players have whilst they're playing. And I remember just reading that, and you know, it sort of like it exploded my head a little bit. And you think, yeah, you know, that's all of a sudden you completely get why performances will always be different on the day, but also that's something to kind of really step into and to try and embrace a little bit. Like whether that's for you know, and that interaction I think can be about so many things. Like whether for us it's like, you know, if you and me are playing, is it a thing of like, you know, you're playing slightly ahead of me, or do I want to try and push you along? But then even things like if, you know, if you go to an orchestral gig or like classical performance or something like that, sometimes you'll hear like a string section not, you know, interact on trying to how to find the tuning of a chord or something like that. And it's just these little tiny things where people are actually paying attention to one another that actually, I think, make the thing kind of come off the page a little bit and actually lift it into a performance rather than just, you know, a kind of, I don't want to call it a fancy playback, that's derogatory, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. What you mean. I think, you know, it's also quite interesting because, for example, something that in the past years I really tried to focus on and helped me a lot in my journey is dynamics, which is something that when I was younger, I was always disregarding. I'm like, oh, like that joke. Oh, what do you mean more dynamics? I'm playing as loud as I can, right? I mean, obviously, I'm not a soft drummer, but I like to try and incorporate different dynamics over the course of a thing.
Out of interest, then, like why was it being disregarded? Like I'm always interested.
Not willingly. I was just focused on the craft. So basically on my technique, on getting things right. And then I think it's like, when you dep on a show the first time, you're like so focused on the page, and then slowly, you do 2 or 3 shows, and your view starts to get wider, right? And it's the same for me. Like when I was younger, I was focusing on, okay, I need to be able to play this well. And then once you play it well technically, then you can focus on all the nuances. I think.
100%. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's one of those things that just comes with age and experience. I mean, and I think with also perhaps just doing a certain amount of gigs, you do just have a not like an arrogance, but a certain amount of confidence in yourself that allows you to detach from the immediate things that your hands are doing and actually just get your head up and look around. So I know what you mean. I'd probably say I was the same.
Yeah. So we have a similar musical upbringing then.
Yes, we do.
I know that obviously you have a very successful bass YouTube channel and online school as well. I wonder, how do you, well, first of all, how did it come up? Why did you decide to do this online thing? And then how do you manage to apply this vision that you have about teaching to a larger scale audience? Like obviously, one-on-one is one thing, but when you have 20, 30, 100, 1,000 people to teach, it's different, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the the slightly unflattering answer of how did this come about? The idea was like a business from the start.
Okay.
I feel like what I should be saying, to make myself look better is it was a passion thing, and it's just kind of and there was an element of that for sure, but there was also a kind of thing of this could be a legit business, so why not try and pursue it as such? I mean, but saying that, I have always, the more and more I think about it, I've always enjoyed teaching, and I think the reason is because I always I enjoy learning and discussing about learning, and doing this sort of stuff. I mean, it's sort of funny for in a sense that we're doing something like this, because for people listening, what they won't see is they won't see the 100th time we've come into sat in your drum booth on the show and been like, oh, what do you think of this? Let's talk about that. So yeah, it
which happens often.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like a very natural thing to do, and I think also for a lot of musicians, most musicians have the thing of they want to get better just for the sake of doing so. So I think it's quite a natural thing. I mean, so yeah, with regards to how did it come about? Yeah, that was the idea from the start, and it was literally one of those things of where again, getting back to paying attention to your experiences, I've kind of been led like that from the start. You do one video, you put it up, and it didn't get many views at all. So you're oh, I wonder why that is. And then you just put up another one, and then by chance, it didn't get loads, but it got a lot more. And I'm oh, why? And then, you kind of go down the rabbit hole of Googling how to get views on YouTube, and then people are
we've all done it.
And it sort of snowballed on from there, really. But I think the really great thing about it is, for me, when it comes to the scaling of it, I think the job of a good teacher is, in a nutshell, I think for me it's about trying to use your past to help other people assess their present. As as lofty as that can sound a little bit, which is why if if I look back over a lot of the videos, the way to scale it has not been so much. Basically, the channel has transitioned much more from a kind of doing normal lessons to a camera style setup to actually me trying to talk, sort of teach lessons through the experiences I'm having as a professional, if that makes sense. And I think that's been a much more like relatable and scalable way of doing things, because musicians of all levels, in some senses have a lot of the same problems. Like everyone wants to know how they can learn songs better. Everybody wants to know how they can play better. And for me, a lot of the times it comes back to just sort of making sure you've got an actual set approach of how to tackle a problem. And that approach can be really sophisticated. It can be really simple. But just in terms of like almost having like a good learning technique, like those are the things that I'm trying to, teach to people and sort of trying to impart, as it were. And yeah, I think, just trying to, demonstrate through the experiences you're having seems to be a much more scalable, but also like a much more digestible way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. And what about your online school? Like, how have you set that up, and what do you do in it? I think you have quite a few people that are following that school, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, with that, the approach to that was slightly different. I have to say, like with that, originally when I started it, I started, making online courses and stuff and putting that up, and it's pivoted much more towards trying to have like live video workshops and trying to give as much in-person feedback as I can. And the reason for that was literally just people would just write after, if they sort of take a course, let's say, people would write back and they'd say, like, really enjoyed it. Could I get your feedback on something? And it was one of those times where it's almost like getting hit in the face with a wet fish. You sort of like, how many times does this have to happen before I go, do you know what, I should really charge for this and make it a thing? Yeah, so, eventually I put two and two together. The format of that, it is very different. That is much more of the type of lessons that you would get at a school or a university or whatever. But I think the thing that feels quite nice about it is it's only that because that's at the moment what people seem to be asking for. And again I think that's just sort of what you have to accept as a teacher. Like it's one thing to have an idea of what you want to do, but ultimately you are there to help other people. So, maybe if I hope it's still around in like 5 years' time or so, but if the people are sort of saying that they really want something different in 5 years' time, maybe it becomes something different. I don't know. But you just have to be willing to kind of say, okay, well, look, everyone is where they are, what can I do to help? Rather than say like, trying to impose something that they don't, not necessarily that they don't want on them. We've all got to have a mixture of learning stuff that we need to know and stuff that we want to know, but you do have to meet people where they are, in my opinion.
Yeah. Is there anything that you noticed in your wide experience of teaching that people are lacking in the sense of either technically or concept-wise that you think people should really pay attention to?
Honestly, I think people don't learn enough music. Like as obvious as that sounds, for me, when I started learning, I was incredibly lucky to have a series of good teachers. But the very first teacher I ever had, it was actually a guitar player called Paul Cordell, and I think he noticed very early on in me that I really wanted to just learn songs, but he was still trying to say, okay, well, we've got to learn theory and we've got to learn all the technical stuff. So he would just basically try and teach me it in the context of songs. So if we're playing, I don't know, let's say we're learning a song and there's like a perfect cadence in there, he'd sort of like highlight those, I don't know, 3 bars or 4 bars or 8 bars and say, okay, do you know what this is? And we discussed the theory from there. But all these theoretical aspects, one, they were never divorced from actual songs. But two, it gave me like a really keen grasp in hindsight of like how these things actually sounded. Again, as obvious as that sounds, but this sort of ties in, I suppose, to what we were talking about before about learning. But as I got much older, and you start to read books about how to learn and how elite performers work and all of that stuff. I came across a concept called mental modeling, which is in a book called Peak, if I remember right, where basically the idea is a mental model is like how sophisticated your mental concept of executing a particular task is. The really, really great thing about studying songs from the get-go is that even with a lot of the stuff that I wasn't necessarily able to play or that I didn't understand, I still had some conception of how it was supposed to sound. By no means did that mean I could sort of do all this stuff right away at all. Like, there's still plenty of things I'm terrible at. But
Same here.
But I think what it really did help is that when you come to sit down and do your own practice, you can actually start to self-direct and self-teach with much more accuracy and much more efficiency. Like, there's a lot more leverage to your practice. You're getting much more out because you can, if you're, let's say you're trying to learn walking bass or something like that, and instead of playing, sort of straight quarter notes like doong 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 like that, you're playing some syncopated funk thing or like a rock riff. If you've listened to Ron Carter or any of the Oscar Peterson records or whatever, you can say, actually, you know what, I don't know why, but for some reason it doesn't sound like walking bass. I should at least try and do something similar. So I think that was a huge thing. And
so
I think
give yourself benchmarks.
Yeah, give yourself benchmarks, but inform them by what better people actually do. This is like my big gripe really at the moment. I think not enough people study what musicians actually do, and what composers actually do, what great players actually do, and so on. And I think a lot of that has kind of given way to, play, this mode over this chord, or learn this polyrhythm against this click, and all of that stuff is cool. But I think in the grand scheme of things, like in terms of how you might go from learning an exercise to being a good musician, for me, the insight has been there that exercises I think are actually just to get the ball rolling. And then from after there has to come out, like, do transcriptions of, good songs, like study famous scores of classical pieces or whatever you're into, and actually see how people use this stuff. And I think that's, what's the way to put it? If you think about it, let's say if you study a classical score, let's say like a Beethoven piano sonata or something like that, in a sense, I think that score serves as like a document of the way that Beethoven was thinking at the time. Likewise, if you transcribe a Pat Metheny solo, similar thing, that your transcription is a document of the way that he was interpreting those chords, or that groove or whatever, to an extent. And that's the sort of thing where you're never going to get that interpretive know-how. You're never going to get that kind of experience from not studying music. It's kind of the only way you can really do it. That the same as when you go to you go to a foreign country and you learn the language. Like, it's actually, I had this when we were in Düsseldorf. Was that Christmas 2022 to 23? I think that was it, right? Yeah. Me and Alessandra did 3 weeks in Düsseldorf with Bat Out of Hell, and I was like, I'll try and learn some German. Like, why not? And I kind of do the classic thing of like, if I want to get a coffee, I look up the really correct, thing to say, as if I'm going to walk in there and be like, "Good day, sir. I would please like a." Yeah, and you get in there, and then the woman in front of you in the line just walks up and says "Americano, please," and you're like, "Oh yeah, like this is what German people actually say." So why don't I do that? And you get by a lot better,
Yeah.
and it's exactly the same thing. Like yes, exercises and everything are great, but the trouble with just doing that is that when you go into a show, that's not what anyone does. They think much more, as you say, about like dynamics and about interpretation and about how to interact and all that stuff, and the more kind of like larger scale things. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making much sense. I don't want to keep like rambling, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it's much. It makes a lot of sense actually. And on this, I wanted to also ask you your opinion because it links to this. On how to become a better musician. I was actually talking to a dear friend of mine yesterday about it, which I'm hoping to get on the podcast. Giancarlo, if you're listening, this is your next invitation. And he was saying he's a great drummer. He's working on in New York and doing a lot of cool stuff. And he was saying, sometimes instead of maybe practicing double pedal for an hour, it's better if you go and practice bass for an hour, as a drummer, or piano for an hour, and that will improve your musicianship a lot. And obviously, I know that you're also doing piano and arranging. What do you think of this concept? Do you think is a good advice for people?
Spot on. I mean, it's so this kind of ties into yeah. Okay, so my route through all of this. First of all, I agree 100% with him, and the reason why is actually whenever this was, I think around between like maybe 2019 and 2022, I read a series of books, one of which I'm actually rereading at the moment. It's brilliant. Series of books by a classical musician called Charles Rosen. So he's done, like a few on each of the different periods. So there's like a classical music book, there's a romantic music book, there's one on like sonata forms and so on.
I knew you were a romantic.
Yeah, yeah, it's just because I'm on the podcast with you, man. The heart wants what it wants.
I can feel the love.
But one of the most, like, this changed, it's one of those experiences like this sort of changed how I heard music almost overnight, where the classical music bit has this section on what he calls structural dissonance. And I remember at the time when I was reading that, I was thinking, like, what? Like how... Because to me, at the time, like, dissonant meant, like, two notes when played together that don't really fit, and, like, instantaneously they kind of cause a clash. And you're like, okay, well, how can something be, like, dissonant over time? I was like, okay. So I kept reading, and it was fascinating. They had this whole bit of, like, if they're moving from one key to another, you don't have to have loads of dissonant notes, but if one key is confirmed by like a really strong cadence, on the other key there's no cadence, you just kind of slip into it. The two keys, by contrast, over the course of like 4 minutes, let's say, the key with the cadence feels much more stable. The other key, you can't tell if you're actually in the key, or you're just kind of borrowing chords or something like that. By contrast, they feel much less stable, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. And or there's another one. I'll send you. This is fascinating.
Yeah, I would love to.
There's a Mozart string quartet. I think it's number 17 or 21. One of the two. Basically, the idea is that the opening section he all kind of built on dissonant, and then the thing that was dissonant to that was like a really nice, consonant section. But the dissonant bit is like, it's fascinating. Like there's some stuff that almost sounds a bit like polytonal to us.
Okay.
But then, like, part of the dissonance is that loads of the phrases, they just go nowhere. Like, they just stop. And it's kind of, the equivalent of just, like, conversations that just finish mid-sentence or something. It's fascinating. But what it really got to me, like, getting back to Giancarlo's point, is that sometimes the way to make a piece of music sound good is you realize that actually what the listener should be focusing on is what somebody else is doing. So from a kind of structural perspective, When it comes to the transition to a verse to a chorus, actually, I don't need to do anything sometimes to make that sound good. I literally just need to play what I'm going to play
and leave space.
Yeah, and I think like that's what people mean. I think by the whole leaving space thing, because like maybe somebody else has got the punchline, so to speak. So like let them have it.
Yeah.
But
again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, like experience, right? Like you don't know what you don't know. So until you experience it and you understand it and you're like, oh, that's what they mean about leaving space. You can't really practice it. You can't practice
totally.
living space, you know?
Yeah, totally. Like it has to be a thing of like you've done the listening and you've kind of understood a piece of music across a period of time. I mean, to sort of draw an analogy, I think with behaviors that some people have in their own lives is like some points you can only make to yourself or other people across a period of time. Like if you want to be disciplined, you can only be disciplined by definition almost across a period of time. You can't sit down and say, I'm going to be disciplined now. It's about like how many times do you come back to the gym across the course of 6 months? How many times do you sit down to practice across the course of a year or so on?
I think the gym is a great example actually, because if you go to the gym one day, you're not going to see the difference. Like if you look at yourself, from one day to another, even after 6 months, one day is not making a difference. But if you look at yourself 6 months later from when you started, you will see the difference.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's with, so I think with what Giancarlo's saying about like sometimes the best thing to do is sit down and play piano or bass or whatever. It's so spot on to me because again, I think it's one of those things that helps you. It almost goes back to what we were saying right at the start. It helps you adopt that viewpoint of, the bird's eye view of what's happening in the totality of the pieces of music that you're playing.
Yeah.
And this, happens all the time as a bass player. Like, if you've got like a low F sharp, let's say, sometimes you might not realize that, that's not a root note. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's, I don't know, the third, maybe it's an inversion, maybe it's a pedal tone or something like that. And if you haven't listened to enough music, you haven't sort of really developed your ear to hear that. I used to see this actually a lot of the time in the students when I taught at uni, particularly with things like chord inversions and pedal tones. They wouldn't realise that if they've just got one low note like an F sharp, like that's the kind of thing that's given the effect of like this really expansive thing because people change the chords over the top, and they would try and like put in fills and put in other notes. I'm like, no, you're undermining the whole thing. Like, it stops being a pedal tone if you do all of that. And it's the same for us. Like we've got. Thinking particularly about like the show we've got at the moment, there's in some of the ballads, there's a couple of really cool changes of key that sort of, they're not done through like cadences. You kind of slide in from one key to another and it feels quite abrupt, but that's the point. And in those cases, like you've literally just got to let the notes do the work. You don't have to, do some sort of massive fill because it would ruin it. It's you don't have to try and make it sound smooth. That would ruin it because it's all about like if you've the more instruments you can play, the more you can understand about the totality of something. So you can understand really
the
like
big picture
in a song. Yeah,
that's lovely. I mean, this is a great advice and great talk. I think people with people that are coming out of school, this is really what I think you should be focusing on. As we said before, when you're in school, you're like that on your technique, on your harmony, on your theory, but then you have to open up to other things, and not just your instrument. Other instruments, the music in general, more listening, and get the music absorbed as well,
Yes. Yeah. Oh man, that's a good.
I think that's a great thing as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. Like, sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
No, I was gonna move on to asking you actually about something that is related to the, music, but not strictly musical. I know you've been touring for a long time, both with musicals, with artists. with a lot of different situations. What is something that you learned about touring, not musical, but life on tour? Like something that can be helpful for young people that are starting to do this as well.
Oh man, I think like really, as much as you can, like try and take care of yourself, but also like don't get upset when other people want to do the same. I think like let people kind of be different, and like this comes with a caveat. And like certainly in my younger years, I was terrible at this. So this is coming from like painful experience. But yeah, I think for me, one of the worst things I do whenever I'm on a tour is like I don't rest enough ever. Certainly with the first Bat tour, we had this one stretch of it was like a very stop and start tour because of COVID and all this stuff. But if I remember right, we did 8 weeks on, 8 weeks off, 8 weeks on, 6 weeks off, and then we had like 20 weeks without a break. And in that, that 20 weeks without a break is really tough anyway. But within that, I was like, oh well, I started like hitting the gym a lot, which obviously a good thing to do. But then I was like, okay, I really want to get to grips with all this YouTube stuff and do a better job there. So I'd be like doing videos and editing and thumbnails and that kind of thing. But then I was also like, I don't want to let my playing slip. So in between, like, I don't know, walking from the gym to home, I'd be like, okay, I'll listen to, I don't know, an interview or a podcast or audiobook, do something like that. And then if I got home and I was like, my body's saying, okay, you need to sit down and just try and sleep a bit more. I was like, nah, it doesn't matter. I'll go out for coffee and just sort of like, keep going. And I just got destroyed completely. Yeah. And then eventually you sort of realize that it's fine to want to do a lot of stuff, but you also, sometimes you just need to stay at home and just, maybe work from just being sat on the couch. Like it's not as like Instagram glamorous at all. But you do feel better. And I think one of the big insights as well for all of that is that, the people that you tour with, weirdly enough, are the people that get asked back a lot are the people that kind of allow you to do that. They're not always trying to say like, oh, come out for beers with us tonight or whatever if you don't want to go. But then the other thing you've got to realize is like some people are going to be different to you. So you can't just like try and impose what you want on everybody, because some people will want to go out for beers every night and they'll feel good about it and they'll feel fine, and that's just kind of the way that they do it, just like don't I try not to say don't be tyrannical. I think that's really too strong, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. I think it's important to understand when people need their space and give it to them, let everyone do their own thing when they need to, and then if they want to hang, if they don't want to, that's fine, But it's very tiring, it's hard work being on tour constantly with no break. You're not sleeping in your own bed, you're traveling in your day off back and forth from home. There's not really much rest,
Well, yeah, and like one thing can I'm thinking particularly about I think it was the one time where you and I were both traveling back from Glasgow, and I think I luckily got like a train maybe half an hour before you. So I get a train half an hour before. Like it was slow, but I got back in decent time. And then I think, was it like a tree on the line or something like that had come down?
I was there with our common friend Ben Witherspoon guitar.
Ben Witherspoon, yeah.
It took like 13 hours to come back.
But also like when those things happen, just like maybe it's not even a musician's thing. Like it's very tempting to think that, oh, okay, well, because I've made a schedule for myself, I'll stick to it. And sometimes the best thing is just say like, you know what, just make sure you rest. Weirdly, one of my, I think it was my A-level music teacher. So this is like when you're in the UK, like when you're 16 to 18. So that's like high school, I think, in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He used to have this thing, like he would tell us before exams, it's like, if you're too nervous and you can't sleep, that's fine, but just stay in bed because at least you're resting. And I was like, oh yeah, like that really stuck with me. And I think touring is the same. Like it can be really hard work. just around the UK, like never mind if you go abroad or something like that.
And you know something about going abroad and far.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, so I was just thinking that with so we Alessandro and myself, we went to I think you came with us to New Zealand, and then the tour moved on to Australia.
For 2 days, I came to New Zealand.
Yeah, so like, this is the kind of thing that you got to navigate if you're going to do this as a professional. Like you might be going to New Zealand for 2 days. I mean, weirdly, after we came back, I saw other people that played that same arena who like they were there for like 18 hours, or so like, we were lucky for 2 days. So, yeah, I mean the journey out there was horrendous. It was like 36 hours of flying or something,
non-stop.
Yeah, and of course because I'm a moron, I was like, well, I'll get there and I'll like
I didn't want to say it, but you said it.
It's willfully admitted, but I'll get up and I'll go to the gym and I'll explore and everything. And I remember the first time we got there, we landed in Auckland. We'd been awake for what felt like ages. We managed to push through until 10 p.m. at night. So I was like, okay, cool. I'll pass out, I'll go to sleep. And I slept, I think, probably about 12 hours. But then I woke up the next day and you're like, immediately it feels, because you've not adjusted to the time shift. You get up.
Suddenly, but it feels night.
Yeah. It felt like I was waking up in the middle of the night, having been asleep for 12 hours, and it constantly felt like the floor was shaking because you should be sleep deprived, but you're not. And that's one of those times where you realise you're like, you know what, just have the day off.
Yes.
Don't be an idiot. Don't go and lift weights or go running or anything like that. Just have the day off.
Yeah, that's crazy stories.
Times.
I guess. Obviously, going back, about your experience with touring with artists and shows, and doing gigs, weddings, piano works, and all. What is different about touring with the show versus touring with an artist, or collaborating with an artist?
Oh man, I mean, like there's. I don't want to say there's more structure with like there's just a very different kind of structure to both. Certainly with artists, I find like a lot of it depends on kind of where they are in their sort of journey and their ascendancy as an artist. I mean, because that to be blunt about it, that greatly affects budget, and that will greatly affect logistically what's possible.
Yeah.
So if I'm thinking with like back to the first Leia Salonga tour, she's obviously a very established name. Like we were playing some really good places. Like she sold a lot of tickets. So that affects like, where they're going to be able to, what they're going to be able to provide backstage. Like what they're going to be able to provide in terms of like, transport of getting you from A to B, and likewise we've got another tour with her coming up in the summer, and we've already been told, okay, like this is the schedule you'll be getting from here to here by bus this time and everything. You're going to have your own bus, you're going to have your own that. We expect this and this. Be in this places by this day. The PD will be that. And it's fantastic. It's great to have that sort of structure in place where you're like, okay, we know everything but that's only possible because of the where she is in her career, because she's such a success and she's phenomenal. So weirdly, like how that trickles down, I think, to my experience as a player is that I don't want to say I prepare in a different way, but I think you adopt a slightly different mindset to when you prepare something like that, because if basically the more established the artist is, this is like a rule of thumb, but I tend to find the more set the idea of what they want from their live show is. So that was the case with her. Like if I think to next month, I'm going on tour with another guy called Vince Freeman. So this is like his first UK tour, and he's doing incredibly well about it. Like we're
international as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well we're heading over to Germany. He's got some German dates. There's some promo and stuff over there.
It's great.
Like the international side of it is certainly like in the works, and but it's one of those things because we've done some live gigs. Like last year, we did a festival, literally just to, for the sake of doing it, to sort of give these tunes a run out and sort of see what we thought. But this is the first time we've really done this as a show. So in terms of the prep for it, you kind of just got to accept that like we don't know what this is going to be yet. Like we've done a few shows. Last year we did a few live recordings of like singles and stuff and like videos that are YouTube and socials and all of that. So we've got some conception of it, but in terms of like entertaining people for an hour or whatever, we just don't know what it's going to be. So for me, like what that means in terms of your prep is you've got to turn up, I think, with a lot more options and be willing to sort of go in a bunch of different directions. Like maybe whether that means with like the type of gear you bring, the type of sounds that like I'm using a much more digital pedal board for Vince's stuff, so I'm trying to have like a bunch of different, depending on what he wants, like maybe like 3 or 4 sound options for each song, so you can kind of say, okay, well, if we're going more like the record, I've got that. If we're going to go more of like a live band thing, I've got that. If you want something in the middle, we can do that. So it's almost counterproductive to treat it as like a set thing. But again, that's just because this is his first tour. Like that's like the album's finished. It sounds great. He's an incredible artist, but everybody just is where they are.
How's the process with Vince? Do you get a saying in the parts, or he just tells you, "Oh, this is what I want," and then put your spin on it? How does it work?
Definitely a bit of both, and weirdly, I think this to be honest, this kind of ties into what we were saying before about as a musician, you don't want to be sort of overly technical, and you want to have experience of how this stuff sounds, and also just like experience of people, because they. Vince, like, he's an incredible musician, he's an incredible writer, but when a lot of the time when he describes what he wants, it's much more in terms of like he's coming at it much more from the point of view of a songwriter. So it tends to be more in terms of like storytelling. How does he want something to go? Like emotionally, how does he want something to land? And like the one thing, like I mean, he's obviously got a preference for like how you voice chords and that kind of thing, but much more so whenever we did an acoustic show together last week, and we it was a last minute thing. We didn't have a lot of time to prepare, but we both got down to the venue and we were chatting through songs, and he was talking much more about basically how he wanted songs to land with an audience, and you've got to know how to interpret that. You can't sort of really pull him aside and say, oh, well, do you mean that I should be more on the front of the beat of this, and I should have more like 2K in my sound, and because that's just not how he operates. And also, like, it's kind of to the detriment of the project, because that's just not the level that he's thinking on, quite clearly. So yeah, it's half and half. Like he definitely has got some very strong ideas of what he wants, but then also like I think what makes him such a great person to work for is like he knows when to delegate to other musicians and knows when to let musicians be musicians. I mean, he's been very clear from the start that like he wants almost like set personalities to do things, because then if you've, to be honest, it's the same I think in any organisation. If you've got people that are like competent, they know how to handle themselves, you can kind of let them just get on with their own work. You can let them do their parts, and the whole thing comes out sounding much more like a band rather than almost like what's the word? I don't want to say like a parody of something, but like, if I think you can always tell like when people try and write for loads of instruments that they don't play and they've got no idea how they work, like all the parts come out sounding really
exactly what you mean.
Yeah. He's very good at avoiding that.
That's really good then. Yeah, that's amazing. Awesome. I guess another question that I have for you is obviously you already talked about a bit of about what's next for you, but do you have you said Lea Salonga tour with Vince Freeman tour. Do you have any other cool things coming up?
I mean, well, yeah, things like kind of potentially on the horizon. Like I have to kind of you know keep quiet about certain bits and pieces. But I mean, we'll see. Like I think like once we're done with we still got the rest of I Should Be So Lucky to do as well. That's not
for the next couple of months.
Yeah. There's still that to go for sure. I mean, so we've got a bunch of festivals like booked in, lined up with Vince over the summer. So we're anticipating a big year for that, which is is going to be fantastic. I think once we're done with I Should Be So Lucky, yeah, Vince is like festival stuff. Lea Salonga, I think like June, July. I imagine what's going to be back to like a load of depping. So I
freelance time.
yeah, exactly. I def on like some of the West End shows in town, like like yourself, some of the tours.
Yeah.
But the other exciting thing is like the YouTube stuff and all the online school stuff is growing much quicker these days because I've actually learned how to do it properly.
That's great.
Yeah, so like I'm really looking forward to just doing that. But it's so strange.
And resting.
Yes, and resting. But it's so strange, sort of where the next job can come from. Because even thinking about I Should Be So Lucky, like I remember, I think I got called to do. There was like a proof of concept cast recording of like 3 or 4 songs, which I got called to do in September, and like I had no idea. Sort of where the show was, and it's like production timeline. I just went down and did it, and then like I think like yourself, like a week later, they're like, "Oh, do you want to come and do the show for the next whatever it's like 7-8 months or something like that?"
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you
got a job.
Yeah.
From zero to hero.
Yeah. My inspirational story.
Yeah. That's pretty cool, man. I think this is a great place to stop. So we got more mileage for hopefully a second episode in the future.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to say that we haven't talked about?
Oh God, probably. I don't know. Listen to as much stuff as you can. Study as much as you can. Yeah. If I think about it, if I think of anything, I'll let you know, and we'll do episode 2.
Yeah, sounds perfect. Well, I just wanted to say, Hugh, you've been a great colleague and most of all, friend. I like to call you a friend, even though you hate me. I'm joking.
It's all true.
Yeah. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I'm really happy to play with you every day. And,
it's really been my pleasure. It's really been my pleasure, and thank you for doing something like this as well. I think it's really weird. Like the Americans seem to be much more kind of like quick to do something like this. I think there's a few people in the UK doing these kind of things, but like really not enough. So yeah, thank you, man.
Well, you're welcome. Hopefully more people will enjoy our conversation.
Fingers crossed.
So, well, I'll see you tonight.
Right, yeah, I'll see you at the show. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Take care, man.